The grand kitchen of the Van der Linden house was quiet in the late afternoon, a cavern of cold marble and stainless steel. Sunlight, thick and golden, slanted through the massive windows, catching the dust motes dancing above the spotless counters. In the center of this stillness, a woman moved with a quiet, efficient rhythm. Her name was Elena Pavlov. She was polishing a set of delicate crystal glasses, each one held up to the light, her breath fogging the surface before she wiped it away to a brilliant, silent clarity. To anyone in the family, Elena was simply part of the house. A function. She arrived before dawn, left after dusk, and in between. She made things clean, orderly, and ready. Mrs. Van der Linden. Beatrice referred to her as a good soul. Very dependable. Her son, Julian, when he noticed her at all, saw a figure in a simple dress, her hair always pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. His fiancée, Chloe, saw a pair of competent hands and little else. They knew she came from somewhere overseas, that her English was precise, but carried a soft, musical weight, and that she asked for nothing. They did not know the woman. They never saw the way her eyes would sometimes lose focus, staring at the pattern of light on the floor as if it were a sheet of music. They didn't notice the peculiar, graceful strength in her hands that could scrub a stubborn stain from porcelain, but would sometimes pause. The fingers of her left hand, tapping a silent, complex pattern on her thigh. The calluses on her fingertips, the ones just between the pad and the nail, were not from cleaning. They were old, hardened things, almost smoothed away by years of different work, but they were still there if one knew to look. No one knew to look. She hummed sometimes, while folding laundry or organizing the pantry. It was never a pop song or a catchy tune. It was a low, wandering melody, full of unexpected turns and deep sadness. It sounded like a memory. That evening, the family was in the dining room. Elena was in the kitchen, preparing the after-dinner coffee tray. Their voices, sharp and self-assured, carried through the open door. "The gala next week is going to be a dreadful snooze," Julian said, the clink of his fork against the plate punctuating his boredom. "Another string quartet playing Mozart. It's just background noise." "It's for the Children's Hospital charity, darling," Beatrice replied, her tone suggesting the cause was less important than the appearance of supporting it. "Everyone will be there. The Aldriches, the Franklins. It's about being seen. It needs." "A moment," Chloe interjected, her voice bright with a mean kind of cleverness. "Something to break the ice. Something unexpected." There was a silence. Elena carefully arranged the porcelain cups on their saucers, her movements slowing. "What do you mean, unexpected?" Julian asked. "I mean," Chloe said, drawing the word out. Elena could picture her leaning forward, a spark in her eyes. "All these stiff performances by professionals. What if we had something authentic? Something real and unpolished. A touch of humble charm." A frown touched Elena's brow. She lifted the heavy silver coffee pot. "Go on," Beatrice said, intrigued. "Well," Chloe said, and now her voice dropped slightly, as if sharing a secret, but it was perfectly pitched to carry. "What about Elena?" Elena froze, the pot hovering over the first cup. "Our Elena?" Julian let out a short, amused bark of laughter. "Yes. She's from over there. I'll bet she knows some wonderful rustic folk songs. The kind shepherds play in the fields." Chloe's laughter tinkled, empty as the crystal Elena had polished. "Imagine it. A simple, heartfelt tune on a fiddle. It would be so genuine, so utterly unpretentious. It would show we have a sense of humor, that we appreciate the common touch." The idea hung in the air. Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She set the coffee pot down with a quiet clink. "That's actually brilliant, Chloe," Julian said, his voice warming with cruel delight. "Mother, what do you think?" An interlude in authenticity, we could call it. Beatrice considered it. Elena could almost hear the calculations, the surprise of the guests, the conversational novelty it would provide, the way it would make her family seem daring and whimsical. The risk was zero. The performer's feelings were not a factor in the equation. "It is for charity," Beatrice said finally, her voice decisive. "And it would be a unique contribution. Elena is part of this household, in a way. It's only right she contribute her little talent." The decision was made. It was settled. A few minutes later, Elena carried the coffee tray into the dining room. The air was different now, charged with a conspiratorial amusement. They looked at her not as a piece of furniture, but as a newly discovered prop. "Elena, dear," Beatrice began, her smile wide and insincere, "we've just had the most wonderful idea for the gala." Elena set the tray down, her face a careful neutral mask. "Yes, ma'am?" "We would like you to perform for our guests," Julian said, unable to keep the smirk from his lips. "A little musical number, something from the old country. It will be delightful." The room seemed to tilt. The polished table, the glittering chandelier, their expectant faces, all of it swam for a second. Elena's throat went dry. I do not perform, sir," she said softly, the accent in her words seeming to thicken under their gaze. "Oh, don't be modest," Chloe chirped. "It will be so fun. We'll get you a violin. Nothing fancy, of course. Just something to scratch out a little tune on. It's for the children, after all." The manipulation was clumsy and absolute. For the children. To refuse would be to refuse sick children. Elena's eyes met Beatrice's. In the older woman's gaze, there was no malice, just a bland, absolute authority. The kind that never doubted its right to command. "It's settled then," Beatrice said, ending the discussion. "We'll find an instrument for you. It's just a small, simple thing. Nothing to be nervous about. Simple, little, rustic. Scratch out a tune." The words buzzed around Elena like flies as she cleared the empty dinner plates. Her hands were steady, but inside, a storm of old ghosts had been awakened. She retreated to the kitchen, the swinging door shutting behind her with a soft whoosh. Alone in the gleaming silence, she leaned against the counter. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling now. She slowly, deliberately, stretched out the fingers of her left hand. She touched the tips, one by one, to her thumb, a silent, expert exercise done 1,000,000 times in another life. The calluses met the skin. She thought of a dark case, hidden under her narrow bed in the small apartment across town. She had not opened it in 7 years. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay a violin that had once sung in grand concert halls. It had a voice that could make critics weep. It had last been played at her mother's graveside, a private, shattered melody that had torn her soul in two. After that, she had locked it away. The music in her was a deep, still lake, frozen over by a winter of grief. To play was to remember. To remember was to feel the loss, sharp and new. And now these people, in their palace of ignorance, wanted her to crack the ice for their amusement. They wanted a cartoon, a caricature of a peasant fiddler for their party. The pain of it was almost funny. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped her lips, echoing softly in the empty kitchen. She finished her work in a daze. As she gathered her thin coat from the closet by the service entrance, she heard Julian and Chloe laughing in the living room. "We'll have to get her the right outfit," Chloe was saying. "She can't wear her uniform. That's too obvious. Maybe a simple peasant blouse or something? Something authentically drab." "I think I have my old student violin in the attic," Julian replied. "The one I gave up on in 4th grade. It's probably warped. Perfect for the sound we're going for." Their laughter followed her out into the cool evening air. She walked to the bus stop, the weight of their expectation a physical pressure on her shoulders. They had forced her to the edge of the frozen lake. They were demanding she dance on the thin ice. They had no idea what slept in the depths beneath. The week passed in a strange, slow blur for Elena. In the van der Linden house, the usual quiet rhythm was gone, replaced by a buzzing, humiliating energy that clung to her like a bad smell. The family no longer ignored her. Now, they watched her with bright, curious eyes, like scientists observing an odd but useful specimen. The violin appeared on the kitchen counter one morning. It was resting in a battered black case, scuffed at the corners. Julian had indeed found it in the attic. Elena opened the case slowly. The instrument inside was cheap, a kind given to a child who is expected to lose interest. The wood was thin and poorly finished, a dull orange-brown. One of the tuning pegs was cracked. The strings were old, their windings discolored and loose. She lifted it carefully. It was incredibly light, almost toy-like in her hands. She tucked it under her chin for a single fleeting second, then placed it back in the case as if it were hot. The feel of it, even this terrible one, sent a jolt through her system. A mix of deep muscle memory and sharp pain. Chloe took charge of the costume. She arrived one afternoon with a shopping bag, her face lit with the joy of a cruel project. "I found the perfect thing," she announced to Beatrice, pulling out a garment. It was a plain, grayish-blue dress, made of rough, homespun-looking fabric. It was deliberately simple, almost shapeless, designed to look like something from an old folk tale. "Isn't it wonderfully authentic?" Chloe said, holding it up against Elena, who stood stiffly, her face blank. "It just screams village maiden. They'll love it." Beatrice nodded her approval. "Much better than her uniform. This sets the right tone." The tone, Elena understood, was one of pitying amusement. She was to be the evening's charming, pathetic novelty. The day of the gala dawned bright and cold. The house erupted into controlled chaos. Florists arrived, filling the rooms with hothouse blooms that had no scent. Caterers in sharp uniforms buzzed around, setting up silver chafing dishes and towers of glittering glasses. A string quartet arrived for the main performance. 4 serious-looking young people in black, who set up their music stands with quiet professionalism. They glanced at Elena as she passed, but their eyes slid away without interest. She was just another servant dot as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange. Elena was directed to a small, unused maid's room upstairs to change. She left her simple work dress folded on a chair and put on the rough blue garment. It smelled of cheap dye and a thrift store. It was slightly too big, hanging off her frame, making her look even smaller and more insignificant. She looked at herself in the small, dusty mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed ghost from a forgotten time. She smoothed the fabric with her hands, the calluses catching on the rough threads. Downstairs, the doorbell began to ring, a steady, elegant chime. The air filled with the sound of laughter, light chatter, and the clink of champagne glasses. The party had begun. Elena stayed in the little room, listening to the swell of noise below. It was a sound she knew well from another life, but then she had been in the center of it, the reason for it. Now she was in the margins, waiting to be brought on for a laugh. After what felt like hours, there was a sharp knock. Julian opened the door without waiting for an answer. He looked her up and down, a quick, satisfied glance. "Perfect. You look the part. Come on. They're just about ready for you." He led her not through the main halls, but through a back service corridor, avoiding the guests. They emerged in a shadowy space just off the grand living room, which had been cleared to serve as a performance area. The quartet was finishing a piece to polite, warm applause. From her hiding place in the shadows, Elena could see the audience. Rows of chairs filled with men in dark tuxedos and women in silks and jewels. Their faces were turned towards the quartet, expressions of cultivated appreciation. Beatrice, resplendent in a gown of emerald green, stepped forward as the quartet bowed. She smiled at her guests, a practiced, gracious smile. "And now, my dear friends," she said, her voice carrying easily in the hushed room, "we have something very special. A little experiment in genuine, unvarnished artistry. In our home, we are fortunate to have a woman who carries the soul of her homeland within her. With no formal training, but with what we are told is a natural, humble gift for a simple folk melody. She has agreed to share a piece of her heritage with us tonight, all in aid of our wonderful cause. Please, open your hearts to a truly authentic moment. My household helper, Elena." The introduction was a masterwork of condescension. Unvarnished, humble, simple. Helper. It drew a few whispered titters, a ripple of curious anticipation. This was not the anticipation before a concert. It was the anticipation before a curiosity is unveiled. Julian gave Elena a small, hard push between her shoulder blades. "Go on," he whispered, his breath smelling of gin. "Do your little song." Elena stepped out of the shadows and into the brilliant, blinding spotlight that had been set up. The light was hot and white, washing out her vision. She could barely see the sea of faces, but she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes focusing on her. She saw the front row clearly, Beatrice sitting regally, Julian leaning back with a smug grin, Chloe barely containing her delight, her hand over her mouth. In the center of the floor, on a small, lonely stand, rested the cheap violin and its bow. They looked pathetic under the professional lights. Someone in the audience coughed. Another stifled a laugh. The silence was not respectful. It was heavy with expectation for a delightful failure. Elena walked to the stand. Her legs felt numb, like blocks of wood. The rough fabric of the dress scratched her neck. She picked up the violin. It felt even lighter and more flimsy than before. She tucked it under her chin. The familiar contact, even with this terrible instrument, was a tiny anchor in the roaring sea of her panic. She picked up the bow. The horsehair was sparse and uneven. She closed her eyes. The noise of the room, the rustling, the whispers, the judgment faded into a distant hum. Inside her head, there was only a screaming silence. What was she doing here? She could play a folk tune. She could give them their simple, humiliating moment and be done with it. A few screeching notes, a bow, and she could escape back into the shadows. But as she stood there, the humiliation burned through the ice inside her. It touched the deep, frozen lake of her grief and her music and her loss. It touched the memory of her mother's face, of real applause that shook a concert hall, of a time when a violin in her hands was a thing of beauty, not a joke. A strange calm settled over her. It was not peace. It was a decision. It was a surrender, not to them, but to the truth of what she was. She opened her eyes. She looked directly at the Van der Lindens in the front row. For the first time, she held Julian's gaze without looking away. She saw his smirk falter, just for a second, confused by the change in her. Her posture, which had been slumped and hesitant, straightened. Her shoulders went back. The line from her head, down her neck, to the violin became graceful and strong. It was the unconscious stance of a performer, a stance her body remembered, even when her mind wanted to forget. The audience felt the shift. The whispered conversations died completely. The room became utterly, profoundly still. Elena lifted the bow. She set it on the A string. She took a breath, deep and silent, and then she began. The note was not what anyone expected. It was not a scratch, not a squeak, not the hesitant whine of a beginner. It was a single, pure tone, clean and resonant, that seemed to hang in the air of the grand room long after the bow had drawn it. It was like a drop of clear water falling into a still pool. It silenced, completely and finally, the last rustle of fabric, the last faint whisper dot before the note could fade. Elena began. Her right arm, which had seemed so frail, moved with a powerful, fluid grace. The bow was not scratching. It was drawing a line of sound from the strings. The music that emerged was not a cheerful, simple folk tune. It was deep, complex, and serious. It moved slowly at first, a series of solemn, questioning chords that built a foundation in the air. It was a sound full of shadows and old stone dot. It was Bach, the Chacone dot to those who knew nothing of classical music. It was simply powerful, beautiful, and unexpectedly sad. It commanded attention. To the few in the room who did know music, like the elderly man in the second row, who had once been a music professor, or the serious-looking woman from the string quartet, now sitting at the back with her hand over her heart, it was a shock that stole the breath from their lungs. This was not just a piece. It was a mountain, written for solo violin by Johann Sebastian Bach. It was one of the most difficult and profound compositions ever created for the instrument. It was a cathedral built from a single line of music. It was a test of a violinist's soul as much as their skill. And she was playing it on a warped $30 student violin. Elena was gone. The woman in the rough dress had vanished. In her place was a musician utterly consumed. Her eyes were fixed on a point far beyond the walls of the room. She saw nothing of the stunned faces, the frozen smiles, the champagne glasses held forgotten in midair. Her world had narrowed to the feel of the wood under her chin, the tension of the strings beneath her fingers, and the vast architecture of the music she was rebuilding from memory. Her left hand danced on the fingerboard, not with frantic energy, but with a precise, ancient knowledge. The calluses, those old companions, found their purpose again, hitting each note with perfect clarity. The cheap violin, under her command, began to do things it was never built to do. The thin, nasal tone warmed, gaining a depth and a sorrowful richness that seemed impossible. It wept, it sang, it thundered in quiet, powerful waves. The audience did not move. They could not. The condescending amusement that had filled the room just minutes before had been wiped away, replaced by a kind of awe. This was not the joke they had been promised. This was a truth, raw and unveiled, and it was happening in their drawing room. That Julian van der Linden's smirk had dissolved into a mask of blank confusion. He leaned forward, squinting, as if trying to recognize the person on the spotlit floor. This was not the quiet, invisible woman who brought his coffee. This was someone else entirely. A cold trickle of understanding began to seep into his mind, but he pushed it away. It was too strange, too impossible. Chloe's hand was no longer over her mouth in delight. It was pressed flat against her chest, her fingers gripping the fabric of her expensive gown. Her eyes were wide, not with laughter, but with a dawning, horrible realization. She had wanted a simpleton to mock. She had unleashed a force she could not comprehend. The rustic folk tune was a language of such sophistication and pain that it made her own world of gossip and designer. Labels feel shamefully small and hollow. Beatrice sat perfectly straight, her socialite smile plastered and brittle on her face. But her eyes held a flicker of something like panic. This was not part of the plan. The authentic moment had become too authentic. It had broken through the carefully controlled surface of her party and revealed something deep and real, and that was the one thing her world could not handle. She glanced at her guests, searching for a cue. Were they impressed? Offended? Bored? But all she saw was rapt attention, mouths slightly agape, eyes fixed on the help. Elena played through the variations. The music shifted and transformed. It moved from deep sorrow to a furious racing passage that sounded like a storm, trying to escape the body of the small violin. Her bow flew, a blur of motion, yet every note was distinct, a pearl on a string. Then it would fall back into a passage of such quiet tenderness, it felt like a private prayer. The room was so silent that the sound of her breathing, synchronized with the phrases, could be heard by those in the front row. She was playing her story. The loss of her home, the death of her mother, the years of silence, the loneliness in a foreign city, the feeling of being a ghost in a house, full of people, it all poured into the music. The chican was a vessel, and she was filling it with 7 years of frozen grief. The ice was breaking, and the sound was the cracking, roaring, beautiful flood. A man near the front, with kind eyes and silver hair, felt tears well up and spill over without his permission. He didn't wipe them away. He was not ashamed. This was not entertainment. This was an experience. The final section of the piece began. The music returned to its solemn, grounded roots, but it was changed now. It carried the weight of all that had come before. It was a resolution, not a happy ending, but an acceptance. A bearing of weight. Alana's face was wet. She hadn't even known she was crying. The hot tears traced paths down her pale cheeks, sparkling in the spotlight. She did not sob. She was perfectly still, except for the movements essential to the music. The tears were just another part of the song. The final, deep, resounding chords came. They were not loud, but they filled every corner of the immense room. She held the last note, letting it vibrate in the wood, in the air, in the bones of the listeners. Then she lifted the bow from the string. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been empty, waiting to be filled with laughter. Now it was full, overflowing. The music still echoed in the rafters, in the heartbeats of the people sitting there. Elena lowered the violin and bowed to her sides. The spell was broken. She blinked, coming back to herself, returning to the room, to the lights, to the faces. She saw the tears, the shock, the open mouths. She saw the Van der Lindens, looking at her as if she were a ghost that had just stepped through a wall. No one clapped. No one moved. They were all still trapped in the world she had built from 4 strings and a piece of wood. For a long moment, she just stood there, the rough dress feeling like a cruel joke against her skin. The weight of the performance, the emotional flood she had just released, crashed down upon her. She felt terribly exposed, more naked than if she had worn nothing at all. She had given them everything, but not what they had asked for. And now, in the echoing, speechless quiet, she had no idea what happened next. The silence stretched, thin and taut, like one of the violin strings. It was broken not by applause, but by a single, sharp sound, a choked gasp from the back of the room. It came from the violist of the string quartet, a young woman whose face was pale with shock. Then movement. From the second row, the silver-haired man with the kind eyes stood up. He was not a large man, but his motion in the frozen room was as startling as a gunshot. He didn't look at the Van der Lindens. He looked only at Elena, his expression one of pure, unvarnished awe, mixed with a desperate urgency. He took a step towards the open floor, then another, his formal shoes clicking softly on the polished wood. "Forgive me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the hush. It was a cultured voice, gentle but firm. He was addressing Elena, and the room listened, rapt. "Please forgive this intrusion." Elena, still standing in the spotlight, still holding the cheap violin, simply looked at him. She was empty, a vessel drained of the music. She had no words. The man stopped a few feet from her. He didn't come too close, as if she were something precious and fragile. His eyes were bright, shining with unshed tears. That phrasing, he began, his voice trembling with an emotion he could not contain. The slight hesitation on the descending line in the second variation. The way you voiced the chords. I have only heard that once before in my life. On a recording. A very old, rare recording from the International Levinsky competition many, many years ago. He took a shaky breath. The entire audience leaned forward, a single entity. Beatrice van der Linden's hand tightened on the arm of her chair, her knuckles white. Julian stared, uncomprehending. Chloe looked as if she were about to be sick. The man continued, his gaze locked on Elena's face, searching for confirmation. There was a child, a girl from the East, a prodigy like the world rarely sees. She played with the soul of someone 3 times her age. She won, of course. It was not even a contest. And then she vanished, just disappeared. The story was that after the war in her region, after she lost her family, she put down the violin and never played in public again. The music world mourned it as a profound loss. He paused, his next words a whisper that everyone heard. Her name was Elena Pavlov. The name hung in the air. It was just a name. But the way he said it, with such reverence and sorrow, made it clear it was not just a name. It was a legend. A ghost story from a different world, a world of real art and true mastery. A world that had just crashed violently into their party of pretend sophistication. All eyes swiveled from the man back to the woman in the rough dress. Elena did not speak. She did not nod. But something in her face changed. The blankness retreated, and a profound, weary sadness took its place. It was the sadness of a memory too heavy to carry, finally being seen by someone else. A single fresh tear escaped her eye and traced the path of the others. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of realization. The helper, the maid, the intended joke was Elena Pavlov. The silver-haired man, seeing the truth in her tears, closed his eyes for a second, overcome. "My God," he breathed. "It is you." He opened his eyes, and now his own tears fell freely. I was a judge. At Levinsky. I have never forgotten your performance. We all thought the music died with you." His words were a dagger in the heart of the pretense in the room. The music died with you, and they had asked her to scratch out a little tune. Julian van der Linden finally found his voice. It came out high and strained, cutting through the emotional tension. What is this? What are you talking about? This is Elena. She works here?" He said it as if stating a simple, irrefutable fact of the universe. The silver-haired man turned slowly to look at Julian. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, bottomless pity. It was far more devastating than scorn. "She works here," he repeated softly, letting the tragic absurdity of the statement sink in for everyone. He looked back at Elena, at the terrible violin in her hands. "You made her play on this?" The question was not for Julian. It was for the room. For every person who had sat there expecting a laugh at the simple woman's expense. The shame was now a physical presence. Thick and hot. Elena moved then. The spell of the performance and the revelation was breaking, and the reality of her situation came rushing back. The spotlight felt like a burning brand. The stares were no longer of awe, but of a piercing, uncomfortable scrutiny. She was a museum exhibit, a shattered piece of history they had all accidentally stumbled upon, with movements that were stiff but deliberate. She bent and carefully, almost tenderly, placed the cheap violin back on its stand. She set the bow down beside it. It was a final farewell. She would not touch it again. She smoothed the front of the rough, awful dress, a gesture that was heartbreaking in its simple dignity. Then she turned. She did not look at the Van der Lindens. She did not look at the man who had named her. She did not acknowledge the stunned, silent audience. She simply walked. She walked off the small performance area, her steps quiet but steady on the floor. She moved past the spotlight, back into the shadows from which she had emerged. She did not hurry. There was a terrible, quiet power in her exit. She was not fleeing. She was leaving. The room remained silent, watching her go. No one knew what to do. Should they applaud now? It felt wrong, like applauding at a funeral. Should they say something? What could possibly be said? Beatrice van der Linden, her social instincts in complete disarray, half rose from her seat, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She was the hostess. A situation was spiraling out of control. But what was the protocol for when your domestic employee is revealed as a world-class genius you have just profoundly humiliated in front of the entire city? There was no chapter for that in her etiquette books. Julian just stared at the space where Elena had been, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts, embarrassment, confusion, and a dawning, ugly fear about what this would mean for his family's reputation. Chloe had shrunk into her chair, wishing she could disappear entirely. Her clever idea had been the spark that lit this conflagration. It was the silver-haired man who finally moved again. He walked not towards his seat, but towards the Van der Linden family. He stopped before Beatrice. He did not offer pleasantries. "You had a treasure in your home," he said, his voice low but clear, meant for them but heard by all. "A treasure the musical world has grieved for a decade. And you used her for a party trick." He shook his head, the pity in his eyes now mixed with a quiet, cold disgust. He then turned and walked back to his seat, leaving them in the wreckage. The dam of silence finally broke. But it was not applause that filled the room. It was the rising hum of urgent, shocked conversation. The party was over. The only thing left to discuss was the scandal, the incredible story, and the three people in the front row who had been so utterly, publicly blind. The charity gala was forgotten. The real event had already happened, and it had left them all speechless. Now they had found their voices, and they were all talking about the woman who was no longer there. The service hallway was dark and cool, a familiar tunnel of silence after the blinding intensity of the room she had left. The sound of the rising gossip behind her was like the distant roar of the sea, muffled by the thick door. Elena walked, one hand trailing along the wall for support. Her legs felt weak, made of water. The emotional storm that had poured out through the music had left her hollow, and shaking inside, she did not go to the kitchen. That was part of the old life, a life that had ended the moment she drew the bow across the string. Instead, she went straight to the small, plain maid's room on the third floor, where she had changed hours before. Her work dress was still folded neatly on the chair. With fingers that fumbled slightly, she stripped off the rough blue costume, letting it fall in a heap on the floor. It felt good to be rid of its touch. She pulled on her own simple dress, the familiar cotton soft and real against her skin. It was the only thing in this house that truly belonged to her, from under the narrow bed. She pulled out a small, worn suitcase. She opened it on the thin blanket. It didn't take long to pack. A few other plain dresses, a sweater, a small photograph in a wooden frame, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her mother. A few letters, tied with a ribbon, the paper soft with age. These were the sum of her visible life. Then she knelt again and reached further under the bed. Her fingers found the familiar shape, covered in a layer of dust. She pulled it out carefully. It was a long, narrow case, made of aged leather, scuffed and scarred, but still beautiful. She laid it on the bed and clicked open the brass latches. The inside was lined with faded blue velvet. Nestled within was her violin dot. It was not a flashy instrument, but to a knowing eye, it was obviously a creature of a different world than the toy she had just played. Its wood was a deep, warm brown, glowing with a soft patina from years of touch and care. She did not take it out. She simply rested her hand on the curve of its side for a moment, feeling the connection, the truth of it. This was hers. This was the real thing. She closed the case and fastened the latches. Downstairs, the party was unraveling. The guests, electrified by the revelation, had no interest in pretending anymore. Small clusters had formed, talking in hushed, urgent tones. They glanced towards the Van der Lindens, who stood isolated near the fireplace, trying and failing to project an air of calm control. Beatrice's smile was a grimace. Julian was pouring himself a very large drink, his back to the room. Chloe had vanished entirely. The silver-haired man, whose name was Mr. Ellis, was surrounded by people from the string quartet and a few other guests, all asking quiet, earnest questions. "Are you certain? Where has she been?" He answered in a low voice, his face still marked with emotion. "I am certain." That was not just playing. That was a voice returned from the dead, the lost to the world. And to think she was here. The words "here" and "servant" hung unspoken in the air, coloring everything with a tone of profound disgrace. The charity auction that was supposed to follow the performance was forgotten. No one was looking at the auction catalogs. They were all replaying the last 30 minutes in their heads. The cruel introduction, the shock of the music, the devastating identification. The Van der Lindens were not being criticized aloud, not in their own home. But the silence directed at them was worse. It was a judgment. Upstairs, Elena finished packing. She looked around the little room one last time. It had never been a home, just a place to sleep between days of work. It held no memories she wanted to keep. She picked up her small suitcase and the leather violin case. She took a deep, shaky breath, steadying herself. Then she walked out, closing the door softly behind her. She did not take the main staircase. She used the back stairs, the ones meant for staff, emerging into the empty kitchen. The evidence of the gala was everywhere: dirty trays, empty bottles, the detritus of a celebration that had turned into something else. She walked past it all, out through the service entrance and into the cool night air. The contrast was startling. After the overheated, perfumed atmosphere of the house, the night felt clean and vast. A few stars were visible between the clouds. She stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the freedom. From inside, she could still hear the dull murmur of the party, a world she was now leaving forever. She walked down the long driveway, the gravel crunching softly under her shoes. The grand house, with all its windows lit, shrank behind her. She did not look back at the bus stop on the main road. She set down her bags. The ordinary sounds of the city at night were a comfort, a distant siren, a car passing by, the hum of streetlights. She was nobody here, just a woman waiting for a bus. It was a relief back in the mansion. The party was grinding to an early, awkward end. Guests were making brief, hurried farewells to Beatrice, their eyes avoiding hers. "Thank you for a memorable evening," one said, the pause speaking volumes. The crowds thinned quickly, the cars pulling away from the curb one by one. Finally, only the family remained in the grand, silent living room. The spotlight was off, standing like a skeletal sentinel. The cheap violin still sat on its stand, a tiny, accusing monument to their mistake. Beatrice sank into a chair, her elegant composure gone. She looked old. "How were we to know?" she said, her voice hollow. She never said a word. "She was a maid," Julian said, swirling the liquor in his glass. his voice defiant but weak. She cleaned floors. How does a person like that end up being that? She didn't end up being anything. A quiet voice said from the doorway. It was Mr. Ellis, retrieving his coat. He had stayed behind, unable to leave without one more word. She always was that. You just never bothered to see her. You saw a function, not a person. And tonight, you tried to make that person into a clown for your amusement. He put on his coat slowly. The joke, I believe, is on you. The entire city will be talking about it. Not about your charity, but about how you treated Elena Pavlov. That will be your legacy from this night. He left then, closing the front door with a soft, final click. The silence in the house was complete and heavy. They were alone with their shame. The glitter was gone, revealing only the cheap paint underneath. They had wanted a story to tell, and now they had one, but they were the fools in it. The bus arrived with a sigh of air brakes. Elena climbed on, paid her fare, and took a seat by a window. She placed the leather case on the seat beside her, her hand resting protectively on top dot as the bus pulled away. Moving through the streets towards her small apartment across the city, she looked out at the passing lights. The trembling inside her was slowly settling. A strange feeling was taking its place. It was not happiness. It was something quieter, more fundamental. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted. The weight of their expectations, of their ignorance, of her own long silence. She had walked into that house as a ghost, and she had walked out as herself. They had forced her to remember the pain, but in doing so, they had also forced her to remember who she was. The music was not dead. It had been sleeping, and now it was awake. She thought of the violin case beside her. For the first time in 7 years, she did not think of it as a tomb for her past. She thought of it simply as her violin. She did not know if she would ever play on a stage again. That was not the point. The point was, the choice was hers again. No one could force her to play, and no one could force her to be silent. The bus rumbled on through the night. Inside, Elena Pavlov sat quietly, her face turned to the window, watching the dark city go by. She was going home. And for the first time in a very long time, she wondered what tomorrow might sound like.